The number one issue that's going to dictate our politics here in the UK and in Europe is immigration. Because people see that immigration, they perceive immigration as the reason why wages are lower, things are more expensive, there's no housing, infrastructure is destroyed, the healthcare system is breaking down, and there's a clash of cultures. And they also perceive that crime is up. I think these are genuine concerns that is good to have a discussion about, but it's important to have a discussion based on facts. And that is something that's usually missing. So in today's video, I'm going to go over some of the facts around the impact of immigration on Europe and in the UK from the aspects of safety and change in culture. Because when you talk to people about what is their main concern, even if they are pro-immigration, I am a person who is a beneficiary of immigration. I came to this country when I was 16, but I've contributed a lot in terms of taxes. I've always been working or studying. Um, I see the benefits of immigration because I am been in a lot of companies and everyone around me is a lot of times immigrants. So there is that positive contribution, but people have genuine concerns about how much is too much, right? Now, when you speak to people, there are three brackets of people. People are either have an issue with illegal immigration, which in the UK is around 50,000 people a year. They have an issue with the number of legal migration, which, believe it or not, in 2023, that hit 1 million net migration, i.e. when you consider the people that are left and the people that are coming in, the net of that is 1 million coming in. And by legal migration, we mean the government has approved this. They have issued visas, whether that is work visas or student visas, which comprise mostly of that million. And then there's some that are asylum seekers. So it's approved by the government. The government wants them to come, right? And there's another debate about why is that the case. But there's 1 million coming in 2023. The year before that, it was around 800,000 people, net migration. So obviously, even if everyone that's coming here is contributing and none of them are committing any crimes, this is still going to have an impact on the infrastructure and on services unless the government increases its spending as a portion of its GDP in investing in infrastructure, which is not happening actually in the UK. The UK is one of when you look at the G7 countries, the UK is the lowest in terms of investment in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP. And some people are mainly focused about Muslim migration. That is their concern because their concern is Islam. And I want to go into that too. Usually people have two main concerns around immigration, even if they are pro-immigration. There is we're seeing our culture in the UK be eroded or change in ways that are not aligned with British values, maybe. That's one element. And the other element is around safety and crime and terrorism that is increasing. And therefore, people are obviously concerned about that. You see many attacks happen. And I want to go through the data around this. How many attacks happen, how many people actually die, and put it in context because that's important. Instead of just kind of going with a propaganda kind of video, I just want to go through the facts and the concerns and kind of lay out for you. Is the census that was carried out in 2021 in the UK around the population and the percentage of the population for each ethnicity. So every 10 years, they do this big kind of reporting where they ask people, what is your ethnicity? And they provide that data. Now, looking at white, in 2021, white was 74% of the population, going down from 80.5% of the population. And what has been increasing a lot is the Asian population, right? Which is actually at 9.2% of the population. But when you remove Chinese, that is 8.5% of the population being Asian. Now, for a lot of people, whether that's incorrectly or correctly, well, first, there's a lot of people that just look at race and see from race things that are negative, automatically generalizing the whole population as a particular thing, i.e. that is racism when you do that. But there's other people that have concerns around what are the values that people from other cultures bring, and does that clash with values that Europeans maybe have in the UK or in Europe? And people will say, is that really an issue? I mean, 74% of the population are white British, but when you consider the birth rate and when you consider the death rate and when you consider how many people are being granted citizens, the facts are crazy. Around 55% of all births in England and Wales are white British, i.e., 45% are not white British. So that's a huge disparity because the population of the white British is 74%. So to maintain that from a birth perspective, they need to be having 74% of the birth rates should be for white British, right? To maintain that percentage. And then when it comes to death rate, 80%, nearly 80% of death rate is from white British, because usually the older generation are white British and, they die from old age. And then when you add the kind of about 200,000, more than 200,000 are granted citizenship in the UK every single year, and that's growing. I've estimated by the year 2061, the UK will be majority non-white British. The white British population will be about 49%. Now, for a lot of people, that's not an issue, because if people share a certain culture and certain values, it doesn't matter what race you belong to, as long as you love the country, you share the values, you want the country to succeed. And yeah, there might be, you might speak negatively about certain aspects of the country, but as long as you want it to improve, then that should be fine. But a lot of people obviously will not see that as fine because they see race as the issue instead of the values or culture as the issue. So when it comes to kind of the values, you say, what are actually the values of let's say UK? Well, some of the values are the freedom of the individual, liberty, its tolerance towards other faiths and views and cultures. It's the rule of law. Now, some people will say these are not unique to the UK, and value doesn't necessarily need to be unique to the UK. It's just relative to what other people in other cultures value more than those things. Okay, everything is a relative thing. Some people will say, well, actually, do we have even freedom of the individual here in the UK? Freedom of speech, is that a value in the UK when people are going to prison for things that they say? Well, again, everything is a relative thing. If I ask you, is 200 miles per hour fast? Well, what are you comparing that to? To a human running 200 miles an hour is very fast, but to an airplane, that's not really that fast. And so when we say the values of the UK is this, or of Europe is this, it's relative to other cultures or other places that have different values. And that's not to say the other cultures or other people have values that are of less value to anything else. It's just different things that they value as the top priority, right? Some cultures value religion as the number one thing. That's not really the case in the UK, right? Or in Europe. It used to be, maybe a very long time ago. People argued that maybe it should kind of go back to that, but that's not the case over here. And so when you have people coming with different values that are anti the values of this country, then obviously there's going to be clashes. I am a person who is pro-immigration, but I agree that whoever comes in needs to have we have to have a foundation of things we agree upon, certain values. Yes, have your traditions, have your ways of life and your practices, but we need to also define what it means to be British and what it means to share this culture together and what values are important for us as a British citizen. That is a failure from the government to be clear on those things. Like, a lot of other places are very clear on what it means to be a citizen there, and you need to adhere to these things in order to, be considered an engaged citizen that shares the goal of helping that country succeed. Right? That has been a failure, I think, in the UK because of this idea that they can have their culture, we can have our culture, and we don't need to kind of interact with each other. And it's created this kind of, in some societies, in some areas, has created this kind of segregation. The communities have not been integrated, and therefore it feels like those two communities are living in foreign countries. They don't understand each other that much, right? Which obviously causes a lot of conflict. So there is a culture issue. So when I give you the numbers over here about the change, it's not necessarily about the race change. It's about the values change. It's about the culture change that a lot of people see as a threat to their way of living that they've lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe not hundreds of years, but for a very long time, right? Now, when it goes to crime and terrorism, because that's what we hear about a lot of the times, the facts are very interesting. So let's start with terrorism. I looked at the European data around terrorism between 2010 and 2021, which is what's shown over here. And I didn't know that most terrorism actually occurs by ethno-nationalist and separatist. That's the biggest chunk we've seen in the last 10 years. Non-specified, not sure, it doesn't kind of align to any of these, is what the reports say. But there's left-wing and anarchists, there's right-wing, and there's jihadist, religiously inspired attacks. Now, there's a question is, why do we hear a lot more about jihadist attacks? I'll explain that in a bit. But when you break down the details of this, it becomes even more interesting. For example, when you look at terrorist attacks, completed, failed, and foiled, and arrests for terrorist offenses in the EU, this is 2021 to 2023, so this doesn't include the UK. Jihadism, in terms of attacks, isn't actually the largest number. You have this kind of, for example, in 2023, ethno-nationalist and separatist attacks at 70, which is huge in 2023 compared to only 14 attacks. Left-wing attacks and anarchists is higher than jihadism attacks. But when it comes to arrests, jihadism has the highest number when it comes to terrorism arrests. You've got 260 jihadism arrests in 2021, going all the way up to 334 arrests in EU with respect to jihadi arrests. Now, most of these arrests, these are arrests for jihadist terrorist offenses in EU member states, occur in France and in Belgium and in Germany and in Italy. Well, the top is actually Spain, France, Germany, and Belgium. Some people will say, well, there's a big Muslim community in France and in Germany. Some of that is, and these are actually not all terrorist attacks. This is jihadist terrorist offenses. So there's and these are arrests, not attacks. So there's a question on actually seems to be some kind of link there. The more Muslims there are, obviously, the more Muslims there are, the more jihadist terrorist attacks are going to happen, because we're saying jihadist, which just means Muslim attacks. So it makes sense that that increases, because this is not as a percentage of the Muslim population, but this is an absolute number. So that will definitely increase in countries that have higher numbers of Muslims. That's just maths. So if you look over here for the last 10 years that we have actual data on regarding EU, and in those years, these are terrorist attacks in the EU. And these numbers over here, 306, are the actually religious inspired terrorist attacks. 23 in 2010. In 2023, 14 attacks. None of this is majority attacks, except I believe in 2021. That was the majority. It was the majority of the terrorist attacks were religiously inspired. Now, this is very interesting because you don't really hear about these other attacks. A lot of the ethno-nationalist and separatist attacks, a lot of them are actually to do with France. I didn't know that when I looked at the detail. There's an island, Corsica Island, that people want to separate from France, and similar situations where there's people that want to separate from the bigger nation, whether that's an island or a piece of land, and so they carry out these terrorist attacks. The reason why you don't hear about it is because actually a lot of these attacks don't result in a lot of fatalities, if any fatality at all, really, because they usually target property as opposed to people. But when it comes to the religious attacks, that involves more attacking people, which results in bigger deaths, and therefore is, you hear more about that. When you look at the death rate of these terrorist attacks, I mean, looking just at the last 5 years, 2024, we don't have the exact official figures yet because we just finished that year, but the red line is the deaths in the UK and the EU, and that's at 10 deaths in 2019, and injuries is above that, the blue line. And so the numbers, 2021 is only 3 deaths from terrorist attacks carried out by jihadis, that is. 4, 6, and 2024, these are the provisional numbers. We saw a big spike after what happened in Germany, and this includes the deaths of the children that were stabbed in the UK, and the injuries skyrocketed. But even with those numbers, if you think about just the alcohol-related deaths in the UK itself, for 1 year is more than for the last 20 years of terrorism combined. There is no similarity. When you consider there's actually more people falling and dying from falling from stairs than people dying from terrorism. And only other than 2020 and 2024, there's more people dying from dog bites than terrorism. So it's not the death that, is going crazy by jihadis that seems to be the main concern, because it's such at the lower level of deaths. When you look at the list of the top deaths, it's not even showing up really. And obviously, it's a good thing that there's not many deaths. And at the same time, it doesn't mean there is no concern about terrorism in Europe and the UK. We just saw the arrests. There's large numbers of people that are being arrested for this. Now, the concern isn't just about deaths. It's also, about whether this will continue to increase. And it's also the fear of, I'm a father. If I'm going to the Christmas market or I'm going to a park, there sometimes is that fear whether there's going to be an attack, especially if an attack just happened a couple of days before. And so people are living in that fear. And this is exactly what these extremists want us to kind of feel, because in a society that doesn't trust each other, it breaks down very easily. If we're not trusting of groups of population because of how they appear, then we might even take matters in our own hands, and that results in the breakdown of this cohesion, the breakdown of the rule of law. And that's exactly what also is their intentions, these extremist ideologies. But when we also look at not just terrorism, but we look at crime, I want to go through these details with you. If I look at homicides, this is all from the government data. Even if I look at crime, this is a proportion of convicted principal suspects by their ethnic appearance. It's amazing that we have this actual data. This is from 2021 to 2023 combined data. So this is the average. Whites is 68% in terms of convicted for homicide, when the general population is 82%. So they're underrepresented. Blacks is 18% when they are 4% of the population, and the other, which includes everything Asian mixed, is 14% when their general population is 14% being other. So it's not the other that is overrepresented. And this is the issue we see, is that people are focusing and saying, oh, only this group commits these crimes, or focuses only on the crimes committed by that group, ignoring the facts that this is just in proportion to the general population. Now, there's obviously one race there that isn't underrepresented or equally represented, it's overrepresented. But when you look at other statistics, this is the number of arrests. And what we're looking over here is, this is the rate per 1,000. So 8.4 people, Asians, get arrested out of 1,000 Asians in the population. When it comes to Black, that's 20 people arrested per 1,000 Black people. When it comes to white, it's 9.4 per 1,000 people. And so, a lot of hate goes towards Asians usually for crimes, because we assume that they come from different cultures. And that's the kind of dialogue that you hear a lot, but actually it's lower than white per 1,000 people of that ethnicity. And when you look at the number of arrests, percentage as a total of the total number of arrests, Asians comprise of 6.9%. When the general population is higher, it's around 8.5%. Whites is 60.7% when the general population is 74%. And again, there's a overrepresentation of Black arrests. There could be many reasons, which is not the topic of this debate over here. And then Arabs is 0.2% when they are 0.6% of the general population. And even when you go to the proportion of defendants proceeded against for child abuse offenses, with also the general population percentage to the right, you've got white defendants proceeded against for child abuse offenses is 88%, when the population is 83% white, 75% white British. The Asian is 9% of the population, age 10 plus, when the defendants proceeded against for child abuse offenses is 7%. Black is 3%, general population is 4%, and the mixed multiples 2% and 2%. Again, it's not an overrepresentation, but the way that it's presented in the media a lot of times is that they are overrepresented. They carry out these actions because of their culture and because of their faith, which is simply incorrect. Now, there's a different debate about the authorities not going after people of certain faiths. And I want to have that discussion in a different debate because there are some issues there, clear issues of the authorities failing the victims and a lot of communities in going after people of a certain race because they didn't want to, seems like, cause community division, which is so wrong and ridiculous that it even happened. So the data is very clear. When you look at even the deaths, the homicide in 2023, just in terms of the killings and deaths that occurred that is not due to terrorism in the UK is more than the deaths that happened because of terrorism for the last 20 years in the UK. That's not to say that there isn't a terrorism issue, given that we've seen a lot of arrests that are happening for that. The biggest issue I see from this is the division that's happening in society. And it's exactly what these, we'll call them Islamists, want you to believe. A lot of people have this idea that there is one belief system that all Muslims believe in. The truth is, there are hundreds of cultures that practice Islam. There's about 2 billion people. If you thought that all Muslims participate in the acts that a few do, then the majority of crimes would be, or the majority of deaths in the UK would be from Muslims, not a very small minority, which we've seen the data, especially when it comes to Asians. Now, you could argue that there is one Islam, but there's many ways to interpret Islam, as we have seen. And I've been surrounded by Muslims all my life, and I know how different they can be in how they view. I've lived in Muslim countries, and I've seen how some of these countries won't tolerate the things that the UK would tolerate. So it's not a perspective of this is what all of Islam is. And the issue we have when we group Muslims as one thing is we bring them together, even though they actually fight each other. Because Islamists, most of the people that Islamists kill are actually Muslims because they think they don't adhere to the right Islamic way and practices. And I think it's really important to differentiate between the different Muslims because they could be your biggest allies in fighting extremism instead of what is happening right now, which is you're pushing them closer together, the extremists and non-extremists, because when people are under attack, what they see is what are they closely similar to, even though in reality they're not similar to each other, but because they're being attacked by that one group, they see them as the enemy. For example, in the UK, that would be the case. So to simplify this, Muslims have a very diverse relationship with their religion. And for simplicity's sake, I'd like to divide them in 4 groups. And this is from my experience. I've lived with them for most of my life. So, the first one is the people that are Muslim in name only. So they're born into it. Their family might be Muslim, but they don't actually practice any of the Muslim practices. They may have prayed when they were younger, but don't do anymore. They may fast. They don't really go to the mosque. And usually they're integrated in Western society. They respect, different faiths and different ways of living. And so they're Muslim in name only. The other portion, which I think, from my experience, have been the majority, which is spiritual Muslims. These are Muslims where it's a spiritual relationship. It's a personal relationship with God. It's not about spreading Islam. It's a way of practice that is usually done at home. They respect all faiths. They celebrate different ideas. They're usually very well integrated into Western society. And they can be considered as they see themselves as religious, but not as religious as other groups that I'm going to go into. And they may occasionally attend the mosque, but their focus remains on their individual spiritual journey. A lot of people that I love are, part of that group. It's a personal relationship. It's a personal practice. And they're well integrated. The third is the conservative Muslim. Now, these are groups that are deeply religious, and usually they read both the Quran and some other sources that dictate how they live their life. That could be the Hadith, for example. And their primary focus is religious adherence. And sometimes some of them do not integrate into society because of that particular religious adherence, whereby they may not take action that causes attacks, for example, but they have ideas around how to incorporate political Islam into society over here. They may not showcase it and publicly speak about it, but really they hope that this would spread. That's a conservative Muslim. And usually, there are some religious people that very religious, where it's not just a personal journey, whereby they respect other faiths and they may not be interested in Islam kind of taking over, but sometimes parts of that group do sympathize or support that ideology. Then comes the Islamists. The Islamists, they adhere to very strict Quran and Hadith without contextual interpretation. And this is the trap that they fall into, and the traps that a lot of people that are against Islam, I'm not saying I'm pro or against Islam, but a lot of people that speak against Islam fall into, which is they look at certain verses without looking at the other verses that puts all of this into context. All religious books have certain verses which, if taken by themselves, are extreme. So it's important to have the other verses that puts these things into context. But Islamists don't do that. They look at a verse and just based on that verse, even though there's maybe 20 other verses that speak against that verse or puts that verse into context or makes that verse apply only in certain circumstances, right? They don't look at that. And they often cling to practices that are maybe 1,400 years ago. They think that's the way that we should be living. And usually they are anti-West. They're anti-UK. They don't like Western values. They want they want to integrate Islamic principles into the political, into the legal, and social systems, right? And they see the West as adversaries. Even if they were born and raised in the UK, they've lived all their life over here. And those Islamists are the issue. And those Islamists usually actually kill mostly Muslims because they see them as they're not real Muslims because they're not abiding by the rules and practices maybe 1,400 years ago or by particular verses that are, believed in without context. Usually that group is the main issue. They are the ones that that carry out attacks. They're the ones that usually go out and say crazy, ridiculous things that you can't argue with because they are in the verses. But again, it's the context that is extremely important here because they are a minority. They're not the majority. If you thought the majority of people, the 2 billion Muslims, believe in what the Islamists believe, then this world wouldn't kind of exist, would it? Really. And a lot of, the Muslims that have left their home countries have been driven out by these by the Islamists because of their extreme ideologies. So they've tried to escape that. And now you're grouping them all as one thing, which they are 100% not. And that is, I think, going to create such a division in society where it's going to lead to anarchy. I think we're a few number of attacks away from people having complete distrust from the whole group and starting to taking things in their own hand and leading to the other group also reacting aggressively, feeding fire with fire, leading to a situation that I really do not want to see in the UK. And I hope we don't get there. Let me know your thoughts about this discussion, about these facts. If you did like this, do hit the like button and follow or subscribe. Thank you very much.